privilege, choices and freedom, resources and love. Well, God, I pray that my words would be faithful to you, that all our hearts would be open to the movement of your Spirit in and through this time of worship. In your name we pray. Amen. Maybe you have seen this image of two pictures side by side of people who are looking over a fence to enjoy a baseball game. Three people in each picture, and they are people of different heights. We don't see their faces, we don't know much about them, but we can presume from the photo that maybe one is an adult, one is a youth, and one is a child. And in the first picture, each is standing on a box so they can see up over the fence and enjoy the baseball game. And the boxes on which they stand are all the same height. This is a picture to illustrate equality. Each of them needs help to be able to see over the fence, and so each of them is given a resource, the same resource. It's equal. But unfortunately, only the adult can still see over the fence, because despite the height of the box, it is not high enough for the youth or the child to see over and enjoy the game. In the second picture, however, the same three people are standing in front of the same fence trying to enjoy the same baseball game, but in this one, the height of the boxes is different. The adult has a slightly higher box, the youth box is higher than that, and the child's box is the highest of all. And each head is at the same height. And now they can all see over the fence and enjoy the baseball game. This picture illustrates equity. Not everyone receives the same. Some people get more and some get less, but everyone gets what they need. Of course, there is a third option where you could just remove the fence and then everyone would be able to enjoy the game. But as long as there are barriers in life, people will need assistance to get over them. And some will need more help than others. Working towards equity becomes an ethical struggle when we start to apply it, not just to pictures, but to the real world. And we start to examine ideas like reparations for slavery and structural racism, removing barriers to people with disabilities, or addressing poverty. You see, in our culture, we like to think that we have embraced the idea of equality. Although in reality, we know that we have a ways to go still before we can truly reach the ideals of equal rights, equal opportunities, and equal justice under the law. But when the conversation starts to shift to equity, that's when we get really uncomfortable, right? Especially for those of us whose social position and privilege means that we already have more than others just by virtue of our family, our race, our social class, the world we happen to have been born into. And many folks start to get nervous when we start to talk about things like wealth redistribution, race-conscious hiring or admissions processes, or even increasing taxes on those who have the greatest wealth. Because it's not fair, they will say. And they are right. This world is not fair. In this season, we have been talking about ethics and moral philosophy. We have been talking about right and wrong and justice. And part of why these questions are so hard is because the world is not fair. And if we have privilege, if we have the luxury of time and resources and even emotional bandwidth to just sit around and ponder these questions, Well, we need to remember that we're already pretty fortunate. Michael Schur, in his book, How to Be Perfect, the correct moral question to every answer, writes, "We do not all have equal amounts of time and energy and money to put towards making good decisions. Many people in this world might want to spend their time thinking about ethics and virtue, but they have to focus instead on more pressing matters, like not starving, not dying of disease, or not being killed by roving bands of paramilitary troops. The fundamental problem with applying the same ethical theories equally to all people is that people aren't living equal lives. Centuries of history, socioeconomic development, racism, genderism, coagulations of power and capital mean that two people born in roughly the same place at the same time may face very different hurdles in their life." Now, that is not to say that people who experience disadvantages in life cannot live ethically, that they don't also strive like everyone else to live moral lives. But for those of us who have more privilege, we ought to examine how the advantages that we have in life affect the ethics that we practice. Back before he was the governor of Maryland, Wes Moore opened a newspaper one day, and he read a story about a man who had the same name as him, but whose life was very different from his own. The man who would become governor, Wes Moore, was a Rhodes Scholar, a White House Fellow, an Army officer, and an investment banker. The other Wes Moore, who had been written up in the newspaper, was written up because he was convicted of first-degree murder during a bank robbery and sentenced to life in prison. Both of these men had lost their fathers at an early age. They had both grown up poor in the same city in Baltimore at around the same time. They were almost the same age. But while one man was sent to a military academy as a teenager and given educational opportunities and mentoring and support, the other had turned to selling drugs, and their lives had taken very different paths. So Wes Moore wrote a letter to the man who shared his name, being held at the Jessup Correctional Facility, and the two began a correspondence and ultimately developed a friendship. Wes Moore got to know the other man's story. He met his family, and he asked himself why his life had turned out so differently. He ultimately wrote a book entitled The Other Wes Moore. And he points to the influence in his life on mentorship, presence of a support network, educational opportunities, and he credits much of his own success to personal responsibility. But he also acknowledges that the difference between their two lives had much to do with the unfairness of fate. The chilling truth is that his story could have been mine. The tragedy is my story could have been his, he wrote. And if we're really honest with ourselves, I think any of us could say the same thing. Sure, we work hard, we make sacrifices, we try to be good people, but that doesn't mean that we have also been blessed, fortunate, lucky to be born in the right time, place, circumstances that have made our lives a bit easier, more secure, more comfortable than others. In one of the Good Place discussions we've been having on Thursday nights on Zoom, Doug Nelson shared from a sermon that he heard at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Atlanta many years ago, something that had stuck with him. The pastor said, if we can choose the shoes on our feet, the mode of transportation we use, and the food on our table, then we are among the wealthiest 10% of people in the world. And if that is true, then it might also be true that we have a greater duty to be ethical, to act in ways that are fair and just, and to create a more equitable world. Our scripture reading this morning comes from a part of the gospel where Jesus is speaking to a crowd of people who are very anxious. They are anxious and worried about many things: living under Roman occupation, the struggles of daily existence, even the messianic expectations of when God would come and bring the Messiah to bring justice at last. And no one in this crowd, despite their different social locations and economic circumstances, was free from anxiety, because there were many who had worried about just day-to-day living, how they were going to feed their families, keep a roof over their heads. And surely there were others in the crowd more economically secure and yet still worried about how they would keep what they have. And Jesus invites every one of them and every one of us to free ourselves from anxieties about material things by leaning into generosity, by trusting in God's provision. Jesus acknowledges that not everyone in this crowd, not everyone in this church, not everyone in the world has the same struggles or the same worries. And some, including his disciples, had given up everything to follow him. And yet he says, because of this, because of your deep commitment, because of your willingness to sacrifice, I have given you more responsibility. There is a greater burden on you to live faithful lives, to serve others, to show people what it means to have faith in God, to not lose hope, to keep watch and be ready. Jesus tells Peter and his fellow disciples that they are going to be held to an even higher standard, because to whom more is given, more will be required. If this is true, I wonder what it would look like if we really lived this way. If we really started to structure our societies and our communities and our churches by these words of Jesus: to whom more is given, more will be required. Imagine what our politics, our policies, the ways that we live together in community might be reflected in this idea. It might look like the new budget for the state of Massachusetts. This budget that's going to provide free school lunches to every child in the state, K through 12, comes from an additional 4% income tax on those who make more than $1 million. It's an extra tax, and it's known as the Fair Share Amendment. It was approved by voters in November of 2022. It will generate an extra $1 billion for the state of Massachusetts. And of that, $224 million will go to K through 12 programs, including free lunch and implementing clean energy solutions in schools. $229 million will go to higher education, including making community college free for students who are 25 and older. And $71 million will go towards increasing the number of childcare slots for low-income families. This is wealth redistribution. Because to whom more is given, more will be required. So you can see that there might be lots of big implications for this idea, right? But it's also okay for each and every one of us to start small. Let's revisit an ethical question we had a few weeks back when we were talking about contractualism and what we owe to each other. Do I have to return my shopping cart to the rack? Michael Schur writes, when we are faced with one of these mundane questions, after we apply contractualist rules or seek a golden mean to follow a Kantian maxim or do all of these things in whatever combination we see fit, we need to remember one final thing. If we can even afford to be asking what we should do here, it means we're pretty lucky. We have a car full of groceries, and we have a functioning car. And we have the luxury of posing philosophical questions instead of only having to think about our health or our safety or where we're going to find our next meal. And if we determine that we are lucky relative to other people, and it means that we can afford to do a little extra, and we should. And I don't mean Warren Buffett lucky, just lucky enough that we are able to do something to make other people's lives a bit easier at little or no real cost to our own. There are billions of people for whom that isn't the case. And we have the duty to pick up the slack, to do a bit more than what we're ethically required to do. And if we're not lucky, if life has dealt us a series of blows, meaning our internal batteries are running at 1% and we are barely scraping by, well, we can fall back on those contractualist rules. And we can do whatever we can to address the minimum amount that we owe to each other. This week, I heard a story from the Unsung Heroes series on the Hidden Brain podcast, about people who have left, whose kindness has left a lasting impression on someone else. A few years ago, a woman named Adrienne Drazen was flying overseas with 3 children. At that time, they were ages 3, 4, and 2. 4, 2, and 3 months. Her husband was already at the destination, and so she had to travel there by herself. After a long flight, they got up to leave the plane. She was hauling a carry-on suitcase, diaper bags, her baby in a car seat, her 2-year-old and 4-year-old following behind her, and they deplaned to stop and wait for their stroller. And as she was waiting, she noticed another family. 2 parents, 2 young kids, standing next to her. They looked like they had everything they needed, but they seemed to be waiting for something. And then Adrienne realized they were waiting for her. She didn't want to ask for help, to admit that she couldn't do it all by herself. So when this mother offered to carry some of her things, she declined. No, I'm fine, I've got this. And then this woman looked at her with the most assertive face and said, if you tell me how you are going to carry all of those things to the baggage carousel with 2 little kids and an infant car seat and a stroller and a wheelie, then I will let you go. But until you tell me how you're going to do that, I'm helping you. And so when the 4 of them got to the exit, and she met her husband, and he asked how in the world she managed to get all the way across the airport with the kids and all the stuff, she looked around and she said, well, there was this woman and she helped me, but she was gone. She said many years later, she continues to reflect on this generosity. She said, I'm not sure in her day she realized it, but it made me think of her as a fellow proud member of the Mom tribe, a tribe in which we look out for each other. I wonder how our world might change if we saw all of each other as part of the same tribe. Different people, different struggles, but all human, all in this together. If we were able to recognize someone else's struggle in our own, to remember that when we have something to share, we should do it. To remember that we are all connected and learn how to really rely on each other. Because my friends, to whom much is given, much will be